Hi, I'm Robert Krulwich for Nova Science Now, and these things you see all around me here, they represent the top 100 science stories selected by Discover Magazine for 2005. So we're going to mosey around, and we're going to choose the ones that we like the best as we head into the new year for this special episode of Nova Science Now. For example, what are the chances that the virus that causes bird flu will develop the ability to move from person to person easily on a cough or sneeze? What you don't know is a lot.
That's true.
We propose an unusual experiment and come up with an answer. And can you create embryonic stem cells without creating an embryo?
The experiment was very straightforward. It was actually surprisingly simple to us.
An MIT scientist thinks he can and hopes this new technique will heal the bitter divide over stem cell research.
Those of us who do not want to live with a future of embryo-destructive research, we might have a way out.
And
this is hate mail that I've gotten from elementary school children, handwritten letters saying, please, Dr. Tyson.
Who decides if this is or is not a planet?
This will absolutely rewrite the history of astronomy.
There is something new out there, but what is it? And we examine a 2,000-year-old mathematical mystery musically.
All of this and a whole lot more.
On this episode of Nova Science Now. Big news in the neighborhood. This is our solar system. And a couple of years ago, almost everybody would have told you that orbiting our sun, you would find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 planets. But as of this past year, we've got a 10th. Or do we?
This will absolutely rewrite the history of astronomy textbooks. There's now a 10th planet out there.
When Mike Brown and his team at Caltech announced they discovered what looked like a new planet, they did not give it a name. Names are bestowed by an international commission of scientists, so in the meantime, since they were looking at this little bright light for more than a year, they gave it a nickname.
It had no name at all, so we had to call it something, so when we talk to each other, we know what we were talking about. And so we always give things code names, nicknames, and this one we codenamed Xena.
From,
of course, the TV show Xena, Warrior Princess. Of course, Xena has a satellite, which we had no choice but to call Gabrielle, which is Xena's sidekick in the TV show.
No choice.
No choice.
But in proper scientific circles, when scientists talk about this object, they use
the very unwieldy 2003 UB313.
And it will stay 2003 UB313 until the International Astronomical Union officially decides that this is indeed a planet, which, by the way, they have not done. They're not even close.
We're in committee limbo, international committee limbo, which is about the worst possible place you could imagine being.
But what exactly is the problem? It looks like a planet. I mean, it's round. Planets are round.
Nothing's really round. The Earth has got a bulge in it, and Saturn is actually quite squashed.
Okay, but Xena's round enough, and it's got a moon, which is very planet-like, and it orbits the sun. But it turns out this matter is still debatable because there's no precise scientific definition for planet. And there hasn't been one for a long time.
Did you know that in 1801, a new planet was discovered orbiting between Mars and Jupiter?
Neil deGrasse Tyson is director of New York's Hayden Planetarium.
They called it Ceres. And then they looked some more, they found another planet. And another, and another. The count of planets in the early 1800s was greater than it is today. 13 planets in the solar system. And they kept looking, and the numbers kept growing, and they were running out of names. And they realized, rather than counting new planets, they had discovered a new swath of real estate in the solar system called the asteroid belt.
So Ceres became an unplanet and was redesignated to a new class, and it became the biggest asteroid.
So we've been there before. We know how to demote something.
And that's exactly what he did to Pluto. When the Hayden Planetarium reopened in 2000, Neil Tyson decided to de-planetize Pluto. In our opinion, he said, Pluto is now an icy object that's different from the other planets.
It's got enough ice so that if you were to take Pluto and transport it to where Earth is right now, the heat from the sun would evaporate the ice and it would grow a tail. And that's just no kind of behavior for a planet. We have words for things with tails. They're called comets.
Same for Xena, another icy body that lives in the Kuiper Belt out beyond Neptune. But a lot of people simply ignored Neil Tyson and the Hayden Planetarium and stuck with the list they'd learned in school. Remember those planets in the right order: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto.
My very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas.
Martha visits every Monday, must be for Mars, and just stays until noon, period. So there are 2 stupid things there. There's an and, which is dumb, except the and is right where the asteroid belt is, and I don't know if that's an accident or not. And then I remember at the time, being in 3rd grade, thinking that there's something funny about Pluto, if it really is just a period at the end of the sentence.
Sophisticated scientists and ordinary folks can't seem to get together on this one, and Mike Brown, even though he discovered what could be the 10th planet, has this advice for the scientists.
What I favor is the give-up approach, which is to say, the word planet is not scientific, and it doesn't need to be. And as astronomers, we just need to get over it.
These are the Pluto files, okay? This is hate mail that I've gotten from elementary school children, handwritten letters saying, please, Dr. Tyson, what are you doing with Pluto? Why? That's our favorite planet. You are missing planet Pluto. Please make a model of it. This is what it looks like. It is a planet. Turn to the other page. A picture of Pluto. Dear Dr. Tyson, I think that Pluto is a planet for a lot of reasons, but you treat it like nothing. So if you can please leave it a planet, and if you don't, then I say it is. And have a good day.
Our next story concerns prime numbers. It's a mystery that's been around for 2,300 years, since the days of the great Greek mathematician Euclid. Now, a prime number, for those of you who have forgotten, is a number which can only be divided by itself and 1. And there's this curious thing about primes. They seem, for some reason, to clump together. So if you start with 5, you notice that 5 is very close to 7. And then the next prime's 11, right next to 13. And then 17, very close to 19. And Euclid wondered, well, do they just go on like this, clumping and clumping forever, no matter how high you count? Well, a mathematician has just given us an answer, and we thought the answer so intriguing that it was worth a song. So here it is, Euclid's twin prime conjecture, performed by our singing reporter, Rob Morsberger, for an audience of mathematicians.
Prime is the number that is only divisible by itself in 1. They have no other factors, though they may have their detractors. They are kind
They
of
have no detractors. Everyone loves a prime.
'Cause they like to come in pairs with a number in between. Just like 5 skip 7, 41 skip 43. The name of our lecture is the twin prime conjecture. Primes will pair into infinity.
11 skip 13.
17 skip 19.
Empirically we know this pattern reappears however high we count. Will it keep on skipping just like this, or somewhere down the line will it peter out?
Nope, we think it's going to go on forever, but no one knows.
Euclid first proposed this around 300 BC, but no one's ever proved it in all of history. Well, this year Daniel Goldston from the U.S. San Jose says the pattern will continue in this skippy kind of way.
His results certainly suggested.
Right. Goldston didn't prove the conjecture.
But it's a major advance.
A major advance. He did show that primes appear close together.
Kind of big skips.
Gaps. A big step in the right direction.
They like to come in pairs with a number in between. 11 skip 13, 101 skip 103. The name of our lecture is the twin prime conjecture. Primes will pair into infinity.
Once upon a time, there was a woodpecker, a big, beautiful one, that lived in the woods in the American South. But as people crowded in and the forests got smaller, this ivory-billed woodpecker began to disappear. The last firm sighting was in 1944, and after that, it became a kind of ghost. People who love birds and love watching birds insisted it's still out there, it's alive, it's wild, it's surviving, but when they looked, and a lot of them looked, there was no proof. And then recently, as you may have heard, something happened. Maybe. Reporter Carla Wohl picks up the story.
It happened here in Arkansas's Big Woods, a swamp that's been described as America's Amazon.
It suddenly burst out in front of us and flew across the bayou and into the light, and then we both yelled, "Ivorybill!"
When I first saw the bird, even though it was at a distance and it was naked eye, I thought, oh my God, that's it.
Eyewitness sightings of the ivory-billed woodpecker, the Lord God bird, as people used to call it. Old black and white footage doesn't do it justice. It was spectacular, with a call no serious bird watcher could resist. When University of Arkansas at Little Rock professor David Luneau heard that the woodpecker had been spotted in the swamp, he grabbed his video camera.
I keep mine running the whole time.
And joined the search party.
All aboard?
All aboard.
It's probably closing in on 1,000 hours.
1,000 hours looking and listening for the ivorybill.
I heard a woodpecker tapping over there, but he stopped.
He searches from dawn to dusk.
Woodcock, yep. Oh, cool.
80% of bird watching, he will tell you, is listening.
Pileated woodpecker. And we've heard, that's our third one we've heard today, and we haven't seen one yet.
One day in April of 2004, Luneau was puttering along, his video camera propped up in the canoe.
And just left it running, had it recording like I always do when I come out.
And this is what the camera saw, a good shot of his brother-in-law in the front of the boat, and there, just above the paddle handle, some movement. Even when you zoom in, it's fuzzy, a flash of white. The amount of white you see there is going to be very important.
Did you see that? Did you see the white on that bird?
When he got home, he downloaded the video to a computer and examined it frame by frame.
And you see a flash of white.
Right.
That's the back of the bird as the wing is starting to unfold.
He came to believe the bird was the ivory-billed woodpecker, though at first he wasn't sure.
Kind of blurry.
Yeah, not kind of blurry. Go ahead.
Blurry.
It's blurry.
Blurry or not, this scrap of video is the only hard visual evidence in a controversy over whether or not the ivorybill has come back from the dead.
It's a woodpecker with exactly the color pattern of an ivory-billed woodpecker.
John Fitzpatrick, the head of Cornell's respected lab of ornithology, is unequivocal.
Absolutely. The ivory-bill has broadly white throughout. So here's a bird with white in its back and broad white along the back end of the wings. It can only be an ivory-bill.
The video is clearly not an ivory-bill.
Jerome Jackson, an ornithologist at Florida Gulf Coast University, is not convinced.
Found. Cornell Lab of Ornithology, ivory-billed woodpecker. I think there should be a question mark there instead of an exclamation point. Right over there.
Jackson has studied woodpeckers for 40 years. He says the bird on the video is the pileated woodpecker, the ivory-bill's smaller cousin, still abundant in the Arkansas woods.
I think I'm looking at pileated woodpecker in flight and looking at the backside of the bird's wings.
As a pileated is flying, its wings are held back like this. And so the white is in a different position than you would normally see on a pileated woodpecker. It's holding its wings as if it were paddles, paddling through the air.
We're not looking at the underside of a wing here. We're looking at the upper side of a wing. From above, we see this huge white patch along the back end of the wing of an ivory-bill, and we see just a little bit of white of a pileated with a jet black back.
Fitzpatrick backs up his argument with audio evidence. They have set up microphones in the woods and in 17,000 hours of recordings have something that sounds like the ivory bill's call.
Sort of a
Russ Sheriff is one of Cornell's audio experts. He plays the only known recording of the bird made in 1935.
And now a portion of a recording that we made on January 29th, 2005.
Jackson still is not convinced.
Those recordings are not definitive of ivory bill. They possibly could be a blue jay.
Possibly, says Sheriff, but the last note of their calls is different. Again, here's the one Sheriff says may be the ivory bill.
So you can see there's 1, 2, 3, and then this fourth one is a little bit lower.
And now a blue jay.
All at the same frequency.
Still, Sheriff admits the audio is not conclusive. What they really need to prove the ivory bill is alive is a good, clear picture.
Well, this looks like a good a spot as any, I guess.
And so Luneau is placing motion-detecting cameras in promising places.
A total now of 10 cameras.
Hoping to capture a snapshot of the ivory bill. In the 623 photos taken so far, there are some pretty good pictures of the pileated woodpecker.
But not the elusive ivory bill.
Not the elusive ivory bill.
What we have is a good hypothesis that ivory-billed woodpeckers might be out there. They've given us hope. And I like that hope. I would like to think that they have survived.
I mean, it's got woodpecker chisel marks as
and that we might have a chance to bring them back.
We share some sort of collective guilt about having destroyed the habitat that took this bird out and a lot of other creatures to the brink of extinction. And we've got a chance to keep the species going. We got another chance here.
So not only did a woodpecker make the news last year, birds themselves were a big item, very big, the subject of international summits, White House conferences. I'm talking, of course, about bird flu, and very particularly, I'm talking about something that probably hasn't happened yet, but could, and that raises a question. So far, this new bird flu has not acquired the ability to travel on a cough or a sneeze through the air from one infected person to another. But what everybody wants to know is, could it learn how, and what are the odds? Well, if you look at a virus, any virus, you'll find a recipe, a genetic recipe, a lot of instructions spelled out in chemicals, abbreviated A, C, G, and U. Everything a virus knows comes from these instructions. So, somewhere in the human virus, there's an instruction that says when you infect a person, infect him here in the upper respiratory tract, not in the lungs, not in the tummy, just up here, and make the person, the host, cough, because that's what gets the virus out. It's the way the virus transmits. It's different in a bird. In a bird flu, the bird virus has an instruction that says infect the gut and give the bird diarrhea. So it leaves droppings, and mostly it's the droppings that transmit the virus for birds. So we do it here, they do it there. The bird virus, therefore, does not need an instruction for coughing and sneezing. But here's the bad news. Back in 1918 or so, bird flu somehow acquired the gene for coughing and sneezing. It wasn't much use, it just sat there in birds. But when that virus got into people, that bird flu, because it could pass through the air, that flu killed 50 million people. So you may ask, well, in 1918, how did that happen?
The 1918 viruses have acquired the necessary characteristics to infect people and transmit efficiently.
By accident.
Mm-hmm.
According to Kanta Subarao, one of the nation's leading flu investigators, the 1918 bird flu got its cough and sneeze transmissibility by mistake. It was a random event that happened kind of like this. Are you familiar with the old saw that if you put an infinite number of monkeys in front of an infinite number of typewriters, you would eventually get Hamlet?
I haven't heard that.
Okay, well then let me explain it a bit here. Imagine one monkey hitting a typewriter, at random. He doesn't know what he's typing. But now, let's make it an infinite number of monkeys. An infinite is a whole lot of monkeys. So many that eventually some monkey somewhere is going to completely at random produce a perfect copy of Hamlet. Well, in a similar manner, when one bird gets sick with bird flu, as it gets sick inside the bird, the virus is spreading, copying itself over and over and over, maybe 100 million times. And if you got a lot of birds, like this crowd here, that means in all these animals altogether, there could be 10 trillion viruses. So if you're asking, what are the chances of a bird flu accidentally creating the ability to travel on a cough or sneeze? Well, it's kind of like the monkeys and the typewriters. If you're looking at 10 trillion viruses, and all you need is one mistake, just one, that spells out the right recipe, that could happen. I mean, you got 10 trillion chances. But here's the big surprise. When I said to Dr. Subarao, when we look at a human virus, do we know where in this sea of letters, would you know where this cough and sneeze ability is?
Unfortunately not.
Hasn't it occurred to people to try to figure that out?
But it's a difficult thing to do.
So scientists don't know if the recipe is a few letters long, very simple, or if it's thousands of letters long and very complicated.
Nobody's sure yet.
What you don't know is a lot.
That's true.
Since we don't know the recipe, the genetic recipe for coughing and sneezing, we can't figure the odds. Try it yourself. Let's say that this guy's chickens are all sick with bird flu, and he's got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chickens, which means he's sitting next to 500 million bird flu viruses. And I ask you, what are the chances that there's a cough and sneeze virus right here ready to infect him? Well, if the recipe for coughing and sneezing is 13 letters long, if it's very simple, and there are 500 million viruses in his chickens, seems likely. Kind of like just one of these monkeys accidentally typing a little bit of Shakespeare. Sure. But if the recipe for coughing and sneezing is 13,000 letters long in a very precise order, that's like one monkey accidentally typing the first 2 acts of Hamlet perfectly. Those are very different odds. So if we don't know the recipe, we really can't know the odds. And remember, even if this chicken, or it could be a duck or a goose, has randomly created the cough and sneeze virus, the virus still somehow has to get from this bird to this man.
That's right. That's right. So there are all these events, the probability has to sort of all come together. The chance of the mutations and exposure to a susceptible host.
This seems like such a long odds to me. You gotta have the sick duck has to be near a person who's vulnerable, the person has to suck in the virus has to attach. And yet, it happened. It may sound wildly improbable, but in 1918, it did happen, so there is a danger. But since we don't know the recipe for coughing and sneezing, when you read stories that seem to know the odds, that say the bird flu is coming, or the worldwide pandemic is inevitable, or it's overdue, or around the corner, be skeptical. We know this flu is dangerous to birds. We don't know if it'll be dangerous to humans tomorrow, or next year, or decades from now. We just don't know. Meat. This is a story about meat. Some people avoid meat because it involves killing animals. Other people love meat. They can't get enough. Here is a development that might make both sides happy. Reporter Wynn Rosenfeld has the story.
I like meat. I eat it all the time.
Pork chops, steaks.
I love hamburger.
You might not have thought about it, but that hamburger that he's about to put in his mouth, it's inefficient to produce.
Because of all of the water, grains, chemicals, fertilizers, everything it took to turn grass into cows and cows into meat and get the meat to your house.
That's a lot of energy and a lot of waste. And meat can make us sick. And we do have to kill billions of animals. Jason Matheny of the University of Maryland says he's got the answer.
What we're doing here is cloning, effectively, the muscle cells from a farm animal.
Cloning meat?
That's right.
Who's going to eat that?
As long as it wasn't poisonous, I'd give it a try.
If I can't tell the difference, of course I'll eat it.
As long as it tastes the same.
If you start out with a chicken cell, it should taste like chicken.
Yeah, then again, doesn't everything? How about texture?
Farm animals produce meat of a certain texture because they move around. We have to mimic those conditions in vitro.
In vitro, meaning?
Literally stretch the cells mechanically.
Exercise cells in a lab? Okay, so the only question left is...
You got a piece?
Here it is. Cultured meat.
Bon appétit.
Bon appétit.
This piece was made by scientists at the University of Western Australia. NASA's been interested, and the Dutch government has invested $5 million in cultured meat. Right now, you have to clone a cell and stretch it on a scaffold and feed it an expensive, nutritious soup. This makes each little bit very costly. What if I wanted a little more?
If you wanted to pay $1 million right now, we could get you a kilogram of beef.
No thanks. I'll stick with this. For now.
One of the most controversial science stories of the year involves stem cells, cells that may one day cure terrible diseases. But the problem with stem cells is they often come from embryos, thus the phrase embryonic stem cells. And embryos, while they start no bigger than a grain of sand, can become babies. So there is a moral issue here. But what if, and we're just going to think out loud, what if you could make an embryonic stem cell without creating an embryo? Could you? Should you? Well, we know someone who's trying. Reporter Julia Court has the story.
As he winds through the labs of MIT, Alex Meissner is trying to sidestep an ethical minefield. He hopes the tiny cells that float in his petri dish might hold the key to solving one of the biggest controversies facing science. Whether it's ethical to use cells from human embryos in medical research.
I believe this research has enormous potential, and it will revolutionize medicine in the years to come.
I don't want to live in a world, I don't think anyone wants to live in a world where we're destroying embryos, we're creating them and destroying them in mass quantities for research purposes.
While experts debated here, halfway around the world, South Korea seemed to be forging ahead. Last August, they claimed a spectacular first. A cloned dog. But since then, the Korean king of clones, Hwang Woo-suk, has been dethroned, accused of fabricating his results, including groundbreaking work cloning human embryonic stem cells. The Korean fiasco has cast a cloud over the field, but U.S. researchers still want to move forward, believing embryonic stem cells hold great potential for medicine, since they can become any kind of cell in the human body. But because they come from early human embryos, funding for the research is extremely limited.
Unfortunately, here in the United States, even though we're chomping at the bit to do the work, the kind of funding restrictions that we're under, the kind of presidential policy that we're under, is really the hindrance.
Physician and researcher George Daly is eager to create stem cells that are an exact match to sick patients. To do that, he wants to try cloning technology. But so far, the only cloned cells he's made belong to mice.
We're essentially frozen in time at 2001, while the rest of the world has moved forward very, very aggressively.
The controversial cloning process would work like this. Take an egg from a woman's ovary, remove its genes or DNA. Then get a cell, like a skin cell from a patient, and put its DNA into the egg. The egg is stimulated to divide, as if it had been fertilized. After a few days, the early embryo has 50 to 200 cells. The goal is to turn some of these into embryonic stem cells that would be a perfect genetic match to a sick patient. But because the cloned embryo would be destroyed in the process, critics say This research is wrong. With the destruction of human embryos at the center of the debate, a few scientists approached the new year asking if it might be possible to make both sides happy. What if they could find a way to create embryonic stem cells without destroying any embryos?
I think it should be doable.
Physician and ethicist William Hurlbut thinks the solution may lie in tinkering with the cloning process.
There's a way to get the cells without creating embryos. We just have to have the constructive conversation to find the way.
The challenge intrigued MIT's Rudolf Janisch, a leading expert on stem cells and cloning. With the help of graduate student Alex Meissner, Janisch tried to create something that would yield stem cells, but was not an embryo at all.
What is an embryo? What's important? I think an important part of the sense of an embryo is the potential to develop, to organize itself.
The Janisch team set out to eliminate that potential. First, they took a tiny bit of skin from a mouse's tail and let it grow in culture. With the skin cells growing in a petri dish, Meissner concocted a special virus and added it to the skin cells. The virus went to work and inserted an extra bit of DNA into the skin cell DNA. Meissner performed the cloning, sucking up a skin cell now containing the extra DNA and transferring it into a mouse egg. And then the team waited and watched. Janisch's hope was that the extra bit of DNA they'd added would shut down one key gene, a gene that's crucial for organizing the early mouse embryo and triggering the construction of the placenta.
The placenta, of course, is very important in signaling the fetus to develop. Without the placenta, it cannot. And the experiment worked very straightforward. It was actually surprisingly simple to us.
With that key gene turned off, the unorganized cluster of cells did not develop normally, and Janisch says would never become a baby mouse. But it could be turned into useful stem cells.
The real question is, does it solve the ethical problem? Some people said yes, others said no. It's a particularly devious way to murder an embryo. I would argue, from the biological point of view, it is not an embryo. It doesn't qualify to be called this. It doesn't have any potential whatsoever to ever organize itself to a fetus.
Father Thomas Berg is encouraged by Janisch's experiment.
I think the jury's still out as to whether it's an embryo or not, but I think it's incredibly interesting from a moral standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, obviously. I think what Rudy Janisch did holds out some hope that those of us who do not want to live with a future of embryo-destructive research, we might have a way out.
But so far, there is no consensus about the moral status of what Janisch created among stem cell opponents or supporters.
The scientists who play along, I think, are playing the wrong card. They think, yeah, maybe if I'm clever enough, I'll satisfy all the critics. I think the critics are not going to be satisfied. I think they don't want to see embryonic stem cell research happen, and I don't think they want to see anything involving cloning happen.
Ethical objections have slowed U.S. research. Few labs have tried to use cloning to make human stem cells, and none have succeeded. The Korean scandal means that the technique for humans is unproven. But that, for many U.S. researchers, is all the more reason to keep moving ahead.
I have patients, and I can see a way to apply this technology to study their disease and perhaps treat their disease. I want to be able to use that process today.
If we get diverted into the debate about can we make a pseudo-embryo or an embryo-like thing, you could spend the next 5-10 years trying to figure out how to tweak an egg or play with embryos. I think to spend too much time trying to respond to every possible critic is a recipe for paralysis, not for breakthroughs.
Around the corner, around the world, more science stories in the news.
Hamburg, Germany, toads are exploding at an alarming rate. 1,000 believed dead. And why? Maybe they were bitten and infected by crows. But says German scientist Heidi Meyerhofer, nein.
Solche Ausfälle bei Fröschen noch nicht erlebt, bei Amphibien, habe mich auch in Fachkreisen erkundigt über die Symptomatik und man konnte mir jetzt nicht ad hoc irgendwelche Hinweise geben.
In short, scientists haven't the froggiest idea. Meanwhile, back in the USA, if you drive, put down the cell phone. Because researchers discovered this past year that a normal 30-year-old driver speaking on a cellular telephone has the reaction time of a 70 or 80-year-old. Oh, dear. Phones and driving prove a deadly mixture, and that's no funny baloney.
After Hurricane Katrina, a lot of folks were thinking about our planet and were asking, are killer storms on Earth becoming more frequent? And if they are, why? We've always known that hurricanes on our planet come in cycles, but reporter Chad Cohen looked back at the past season and he wondered, maybe there's something else going on here.
You're looking into the eye of the most intense Atlantic storm ever measured. It's not Katrina, the hurricane that devastated New Orleans. It's Wilma, the third Category 5 storm to form in the Atlantic in the 2005 season. Wilma set a new record, suggesting that more intense hurricanes may be in store. And if there's a reason why, it's out here. Research ships like this one, run by NOAA, take the ocean's temperature every 3 hours, 24 hours a day. As the crew reels in this elaborate probe, they bring back evidence that the oceans are heating up.
The numbers have presented us with one inescapable fact. The surface temperatures of the world's oceans have gone up 0.5 degrees Celsius in just the last 35 years. And there's nothing hurricanes like more than warm water.
The more warm seawater a storm can turn into vapor, the more heat is released into the upper atmosphere. That lowers the pressure and causes winds at the ocean surface to spiral inward and pick up speed. And some scientists, like MIT atmospherics professor Kerry Emanuel, believe that the rise in ocean temperatures is the result of global warming, the heating of the Earth caused by human activity.
Can we say for sure that we're causing that warming?
The last few decades, the temperature has gone up so quickly and so far out of what we've seen in the last 1,000 years or so that virtually everybody in the business now believes we're seeing a man-made signal in the global temperatures.
And we know that hurricanes like warm water.
That's
so
right.
It's very easy to just kind of say, there it is, we're causing hurricanes.
We can't say we're causing more hurricanes.
We can't say we're causing more hurricanes because the total number of hurricanes worldwide hasn't changed at all. For reasons no one can explain, it always seems to hover right around 90 per year. So, if global warming hasn't caused more hurricanes, has it made them stronger? To find out, Kerry Emanuel took advantage of 5 decades worth of data collected by aircraft flying directly into the paths of hurricanes. He concluded that over this time, the average strength and duration of hurricanes in the tropical regions of both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans has doubled. But even more sobering is how closely this increase in storm power matches the rise in ocean temperature.
It's pretty striking, actually, when you look at the graph and the sea surface temperatures go up like this and the intensity of hurricanes goes up. It follows perfectly.
Yes, that's right. I think you can say fairly unequivocally that 0.5 degree rise in ocean temperature will cause hurricanes to be more intense.
This is the equator here.
At Georgia Tech, Peter Webster examined a completely different set of hurricane measurements, 30 years of global satellite observations. His conclusions mirror those of Kerry Emanuel's.
We find a consistency between the increase of surface temperature in all of the oceans and a change in intensity to more intense storms.
But while both scientists agree that warmer oceans have contributed to more intense storms, they caution that formation of hurricanes is complex, to say the least, and involves many other factors, including just plain chance.
Hurricanes are, like any phenomenon in the atmosphere, creatures of chance. If you're interested in any given storm, it is the roll of the die. And the whole question is whether that die is weighted.
The problem with hurricanes is that we can never say for sure what exactly happens. There's always an element of chance. So we take the temperature of the water, measure the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, we look at what the winds are doing, and depending on how all those factors come together, we get a probability that a hurricane will become either a Category 1, a 2, a Category 3, 4, or 5.
I think there's little doubt that we are loading the die. We're causing global warming. The tropical temperatures are going up.
But whether global warming is having an impact on hurricanes, well, not every scientist agrees, even those on the front lines of storm forecasting.
The hurricane is predicted to come ashore.
Last October, as Hurricane Wilma was poised to hit Florida, Chris Lancy at the National Hurricane Center in Miami helped track the powerful storm.
There's distinct cycles of hurricane activity in the Atlantic that it tends to go 25 to 40 years very busy and 25 to 40 years fairly quiet.
If all we had to go on was the hurricane data, I don't think we would be terribly alarmed. We'd just say, well, it's been changing the last 25, 30 years, so what? It's the correlation with sea surface temperature and the fact that that trend is unprecedented for a long time that has us worried.
We're not seeing unprecedented. We're seeing same type of hurricane activity that we saw in the middle part of the 20th century, and it actually may have been busier back then than it is now.
A lot of things in science, sometimes there isn't a smoking gun. There isn't one piece of evidence that everybody looks at and says, yeah, that proves that global warming is affecting hurricanes. What you have are multiple pieces of evidence which all point in the same direction.
This high-stakes debate will only be resolved with more data, and that won't be a problem. Hurricane season is never too far away.
For a whole lot of reasons, meteorological, political, engineering reasons, Hurricane Katrina was a major, major science story last year. But now we're going to add one more reason. We're going to tell you a Katrina story about a young man who got very sick, but he had one bit of luck. He had a very unusual friend. Dr. Tyler Curiel, hold on a second, he's a hard man to keep up with. He runs 100-mile marathons. This is a man who's on his very own path. He goes where he wants to go. Now he's the chief of hematology and medical oncology at Tulane University, where he runs a lab that specializes in immune cells.
We look at the human immune response to cancers and to infections.
But Tyler had never seen anything or anyone like Andy Martin. In 2000, Andy Martin from California was just about to start medical school at Tulane.
A week before I started my first year, it showed up. I was on a vacation, like a last hurrah vacation, and started getting nosebleeds.
Andy was diagnosed with a very rare and very deadly cancer called SNUC.
SNUC is sinonasal undifferentiated carcinoma. Andy decided that he wanted to do research on his own cancer. He persuaded me to allow us to biopsy his tumor.
Andy said,
if this cancer is going to get me, damn it, I'm going to go down fighting, and make a difference, so that future people who are diagnosed with this don't have the same outcome that I had.
The student and his mentor worked side by side to try to find a treatment, even though both of them knew that Andy didn't have much time.
Tyler and him had a really good friendship, as well as, this amazing medical experience together.
Andy came over to our house for dinner many times. He enjoys wine tasting, particularly he was fond of ports.
When Andy was about to undergo chemotherapy and lose his taste, Tyler, a bit of a connoisseur, threw a wine tasting party. And Andy's classmates shaved their heads in solidarity. Andy is the bald guy in the middle.
The Balance for Life Marathon fundraiser will be December.
And the doctor raised money for his students' research by breaking a world's record. He dribbled a basketball for 24 hours while running a total of 108 miles.
He's crazy.
They generated a living cell line from Andy's tumor, the only known cell line of SNUC in the world. And those cells outlived Andy. Already very sick, Andy Martin left home to visit friends at Tulane when he was overcome by cancer in November 2004.
When it came to that week, Tyler kind of took over as his personal physician, and he was there every day at least one time, sometimes more. He passed away on a Friday night in New Orleans.
And when Hurricane Katrina struck at the heart of New Orleans, Tulane University was right in its path. People, homes, property were in serious danger, and so was a lot of science. Tyler decided to stay in his lab through the storm. He was joined by his colleague and his neighbor at the lab, Mike Brumlick. Together, they were determined to protect the millions of dollars of equipment there and the research and Andy Martin's cells.
These cells were very important. This was personal.
Number one thing I knew we had to save was we had to get the Andy Martin snuck cells out.
Their plan was simple: keep all the samples dry and cold enough to survive just a brief loss of power. They spent the whole weekend hard at work.
We had consolidated all of our things into 3 or 4 freezers.
Monday morning, the storm brought winds stronger than 150 miles an hour.
It was like the Wizard of Oz. We'd look out the window and gigantic pieces of buildings would just go blowing by.
By the time the storm ended, their building was running on an emergency generator, but the samples were fine. Tyler went to the phone to tell friends everything was okay.
Mike Brumlick walked into my office. We're in Tulane Medical School in my office. And he said, you might want to look out the window.
And he does this. And of course, his jaw drops because he realizes more or less what I realized, which is that we are in very deep trouble.
And I looked out the window and saw that we were flooded. I had no idea. As far as our research goes, this is the worst case scenario. It doesn't get any worse.
Suddenly, it's a race against time. The men try to move a 400-pound freezer down 6 stories and across this pedway to the building next door, which has better emergency power. It takes them all day to move the samples, and when they finally make it to the other building, the generator there is almost underwater.
Generator's not in a safe place. 6 more inches of water rising and the generator is toast. So we are effectively doomed at this point.
You don't want to be melodramatic, but I was thinking, this is my whole life's work, and it's melting.
And the power fails at about 5 p.m. on Tuesday, and that's it. The only place to save anything cold is the liquid nitrogen tanks.
The problem is liquid nitrogen will evaporate, which means that the samples have maybe 10 days, and then they'll melt.
And you're looking around, the city's flooded, and you're thinking, it's going to be months before we can come back in here. We had no idea.
The next morning, after Tyler and Mike had packed everything they could into the liquid nitrogen, they get another surprise. This one comes in uniform.
You've got 2 minutes to get out, evacuate, or you're going in handcuffs.
It was bang, and they've got big rifles on their back. And you don't argue with people like this. I couldn't find my shoes. And I kept telling them, I'm just looking for my shoes. And I said, buddy, you're going in the cuffs. We left our food behind, we left our water behind, and we were off.
Tyler was headed to Charity Hospital, where there were still hundreds of patients.
I'd been there a few times and saw how desperate conditions were. Mike said, if you're going to Charity, I'm going to Charity.
I had done everything I could do to protect the science, and now it was time to help people.
Tyler and Mike hopped into a canoe they'd been keeping handy.
We'd shove off and we'd paddle right out through that exit right there.
And then they paddled a couple of blocks down to Charity, where Tyler's wife, Ruth Berggren, was one of the doctors in charge.
He said, what can I do for you? And I thought about it and I said, honestly, I need you to go fetch water. So here's my brilliant husband, the scientist, the immunologist. He actually said to me, he said, I'm a perfect person for this job.
By now, these guys had seen just about everything.
We had already been flooded in for 4 or 5 days. Food was low, water was low. We'd been without electricity for a number of days. It was very hot. Conditions were terrible.
They had successfully evacuated the patients at Charity Hospital.
So I realized, time's up. You have to go.
But remember, the clock was ticking. It had been 3 days since Tyler put his lab samples into the liquid nitrogen. He had a week, maybe less, to keep them from melting, including the cells of Andy Martin.
It was scary. It was a very scary time. And my mom even said, it's like Andy dying all over again.
From Dallas, Tyler worked the phones for almost a week. He got a jet, coolers, and now he and Mike race back to New Orleans.
Now, the lab smells bad because we have freezer stuff and fridge stuff that's perished, so it doesn't smell pretty. But preying on our mind is, did the nitrogen make it?
And we had the 3 liquid nitrogen containers lined up, 1, 2, 3. I turned to Mike, I said, Mike, I'm going to lift the lid, and if it's warm in there and the samples are thawed, game's over. And he said, do it.
Together we lift the lid, and this plume of vapor hits us in the face.
It was really cold. It was really white. That's what it's supposed to look like.
By chance, out of all the samples inside all 3 freezers, the first box that Tyler pulled out contained Andy Martin cells, frozen, safe, and sound.
I was calling everybody, oh, they made it out.
So we were high-fiving and just going, yeah.
One of the port wines that Andy liked, he actually had a bottle, and it's still at my parents' house, and Tyler had made some crack about celebrating. I said, well, I have one of Andy's bottles of Fonseca. You know, I can ship it to you wherever you want. He said, no, I'd like it if you would save that, and we can all celebrate together when we see each other again.
Andy's cells were saved, but Tyler lost a lot of research, and he's not alone.
My sense is that we've lost millions of dollars worth of research, thousands of man-hours of research, and then you multiply that times hundreds of investigators, and it's staggering.
But Tyler knows how to stay on his feet.
How about that?
His home wasn't too damaged, and he had to shift his lab work to different cities for a while. But New Orleans is calling. And it won't be long before Tyler's whole operation is back, up and running. So that's our show, but Nova Science Now continues 365 days a year on our podcast, in science cafes, on our website at pbs.org. You can watch the broadcast again, if you like, online. And by the way, when you're there, drop us an email and let us know what you think of our show and what stories you'd like to see on future episodes of Nova Science Now. So from everybody here, I'm Robert Krulwich. Goodbye.
Nova is a production of WGBH Boston.